History is usually told in clean lines: good versus evil, democracy versus tyranny, heroes versus monsters. World War II is presented as the clearest example. Hitler rises from the ashes of defeat, fueled by hatred. Germany rearms through fanatic willpower. The free world resists. Evil is defeated. But real history is rarely clean. Because wars are not just fought on battlefields, they are financed. They are supplied. They are industrialized. And industrialization requires capital. When Hitler took power in 1933, Germany was economically shattered. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s had wiped out savings. Reparations from World War I drained resources. Unemployment hovered near 30%. Industrial output had collapsed. The Reichsmark had little credibility. You cannot build tanks with speeches. You cannot fuel aircraft with ideology. You cannot mobilize an army without steel, oil, credit, and global trade relationships. So the question becomes unavoidable. Where did the money come from? The answer is not simple, and it is not comfortable. Between the end of World War I and the beginning of World War II, Germany's economy was deeply integrated into global capital markets. American banks participated heavily in post-war debt restructuring through mechanisms like the Dawes Plan and later the Young Plan. Billions in loans flowed into Germany during the 1920s. Those loans were not political endorsements, they were financial transactions. But capital does not care about ideology, it cares about returns. When Hitler consolidated power, he inherited an industrial base that had been recapitalized by foreign money. He inherited corporate structures tied into international trade. He inherited chemical conglomerates, automobile factories, and banking relationships that predated his regime. And here is where the story becomes complicated. Some American corporations maintained business relationships with German firms well into the 1930s. Some joint ventures continued even after Germany openly rearmed in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. In many cases, these relationships were justified as business as usual. In others, they were defended as necessary to maintain global competitiveness. In some instances, executives claimed they did not fully understand how their technologies would be used. But history shows that industrial collaboration did occur. Standard Oil had arrangements with IG Farben involving chemical and synthetic fuel technologies. Ford and General Motors operated German subsidiaries that produced vehicles later used by the Wehrmacht. IBM's German subsidiary provided tabulation equipment used in state administrative processes. These facts are documented in academic research and post-war investigations. What remains debated is intent. Were executives knowingly enabling war, or were they prioritizing profit inside a global system that had not yet fully drawn moral lines? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Before 1941, the United States was not at war with Germany. Before Pearl Harbor, corporate trade with Germany was legal under U.S. law, and multinational corporations operate across borders, often beyond the pace of political change. That doesn't absolve moral responsibility, but it complicates the narrative. Once America entered the war, many of these subsidiaries were seized, restricted, or cut off. Corporate executives later testified they had limited control over foreign operations once hostilities began. After the war, there were industrialist trials at Nuremberg. Some German executives were prosecuted. American corporations, however, largely avoided criminal accountability, though lawsuits and historical inquiries continued decades later. What matters is this: the Nazi war machine was not built in isolation. It was embedded in a globalized industrial system. And that system did not collapse overnight when authoritarianism took hold. That is not a defense of corporations. It is a warning about systems. Because when profit incentives collide with geopolitical risk, businesses often delay moral decisions until governments force them. And sometimes governments move too late. The lesson is not that Wall Street created Hitler. That oversimplifies history. The lesson is that economic interdependence can empower regimes long before the world recognizes the threat. And that dynamic is not limited to the 1930s. Understanding that distinction is critical, because the story we tell about the past shapes how we recognize patterns in the present. And the real danger isn't secret conspiracies, it's institutional complacency. The money behind the movement. Let's slow this down. Because regimes don't rise on ideology alone. They rise on capital. When Hitler became chancellor in 1933, Germany was not an industrial juggernaut. It was economically broken. The Treaty of Versailles had drained it. Hyperinflation in the early 1920s had wiped out savings. Unemployment hovered near 30%. Banks were collapsing. The Reichsmark was unstable. You cannot build a war machine in that condition. You need credit, you need foreign exchange, you need industrial partnerships. And long before the Nazi flag flew over Berlin, American capital was already deeply embedded in Germany's recovery. The Dawes Plan of 1924, and later the Young Plan, restructured Germany's war reparations. On paper, they were designed to stabilize Europe. In practice, they created a financial loop. American banks lent money to Germany. Germany used it to pay reparations to Britain and France. Britain and France used it to repay their war debts to the United States. Money flowed in a circle, and Wall Street sat at the center. Institutions like J.P. Morgan and Commerce, Dillon Red, and Chase National Bank underwrote German bonds and extended large loans throughout the 1920s. Hundreds of millions of dollars, billions in today's terms, entered the German economy. American financiers gained influence over key industrial sectors, including steel and chemicals. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, that capital began to withdraw. German banks collapsed. Political extremism surged. Into that vacuum stepped Hitler. Here's the critical part. When the Nazis consolidated power, many foreign investors did not immediately flee. German industrial giants, companies like IG Farben, Krupp, Siemens, remained integrated with international partners. Joint ventures, patent agreements, licensing deals, they continued. Capital is pragmatic. It moves where contracts are honored and returns appear stable. From the perspective of many executives at the time, Germany in the mid-1930s looked like a country restoring order after chaos. Infrastructure projects reduced unemployment. Rearmament stimulated industry. Corporate profits recovered. The moral trajectory of the regime was visible, so was the economic rebound. And for global firms operating subsidiaries inside Germany, the decision matrix was rarely ideological. It was operational. Stay and protect assets, or withdraw and lose market share to competitors willing to remain. This is how systems normalize risk. No dramatic speeches, no grand declarations. Just contracts renewed, patents shared, factories operating. By the late 1930s, Germany had rebuilt a significant industrial base. Steel production surged, chemical output expanded, and synthetic fuel research accelerated. Some of that growth was internal. Some was fueled by foreign technology transfers and earlier financial integration. The war machine did not emerge in isolation. It emerged inside a global economic network that predated the regime itself. That's the uncomfortable truth. Industrial power is rarely national. It is systemic. And once supply chains, patents, and financing structures intertwine across borders, disentangling them becomes slow, politically costly, and economically painful. By the time tanks rolled into Poland in 1939, the foundations had already been laid, not just in Berlin, but in boardrooms thousands of miles away. From industry to war machine. By 1936, Germany was no longer just recovering. It was rearming at full speed. Hitler had withdrawn from the League of Nations. He had remilitarized the Rhineland. Military spending was consuming more than 20% of Germany's national income. Factories that once made civilian machinery were now producing artillery shells, aircraft engines, armored vehicle parts. And industrial partnerships mattered. Germany's biggest vulnerability was oil. Without fuel, tanks don't move, planes don't fly, trucks don't transport troops. The Nazi regime invested heavily in synthetic fuel, converting coal into usable petroleum substitutes. German chemical conglomerates led that effort. But synthetic fuel technology was not developed in isolation. Pre-war licensing agreements, patent sharing, and chemical research collaboration had connected German firms with foreign counterparts. Industrial knowledge had moved across borders in the 1920s and early 1930s, when Germany was considered a recovering economy, not a global threat. Once war began, those technical foundations were already embedded in German production. The same dynamic applied to mechanized transport. Germany's blitzkrieg strategy depended on trucks as much as tanks. Rapid troop movement required motorized logistics. German subsidiaries of multinational auto companies had been producing civilian vehicles for years. Under the Nazi regime, production priorities shifted toward military contracts. Factories that once built commercial trucks built military ones instead. By the time the invasion of Poland began in 1939, Germany had assembled one of the most mechanized armies in Europe. Not because foreign corporations consciously designed a war, but because global industrial integration had provided tools, capital, and expertise. Long before war was declared, this is where the line blurs. Industrial cooperation during peacetime does not automatically equal endorsement of future atrocities. But when political signals grow darker, continuing business as usual becomes a decision, not an accident. The deeper truth is uncomfortable. Modern war machines are not built overnight. They are built on decades of economic relationships, technological exchange, and capital flows. And once those systems exist, authoritarian regimes can redirect them with ruthless efficiency. When war was official, but business wasn't. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declare war. On paper, the lines are clear. But in the corporate world, clarity moves slower than armies. At the outbreak of war, many American corporations still had subsidiaries operating inside Germany. These weren't secret shell companies. They were established business entities with factories, local management, and contracts signed years earlier. When hostilities began, the situation became legally complicated. The United States was still neutral until December 1941. Under American law, companies were restricted from directly supplying belligerent nations with military goods. But subsidiaries operating under foreign jurisdiction were not always immediately shut down. In many cases, they were technically controlled by local boards under German oversight. That gray area mattered. Some corporate headquarters claimed they had lost operational control of their German branches. Others maintained communication through neutral intermediaries. Financial records showed dividends paused in some cases, but intellectual property agreements and licensing structures often remained intact. War does not instantly dissolve contracts. It freezes them in ambiguity, and authoritarian governments exploit ambiguity. The Nazi regime implemented trustee systems that placed German managers over foreign-owned subsidiaries. Production continued, redirected toward war needs. Facilities that once produced civilian goods were integrated into military supply chains. From Berlin's perspective, it didn't matter who technically owned the factory. What mattered was output. From corporate headquarters abroad, the public position was cautious. We cannot control what happens under foreign occupation. That defense would later become central in post-war hearings. But here's the deeper issue. Globalization had already woven supply chains together so tightly that disentangling them during crisis was slow, bureaucratic, and politically sensitive. And in war, speed determines survival. By the time the United States officially entered the conflict after Pearl Harbor, many of these corporate entanglements had already shaped Germany's industrial base. Not because executives publicly endorsed fascism, but because profit-driven globalization does not anticipate moral catastrophe. December 1941. When neutrality ended, but entanglement didn't. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns. The United States declares war. From that moment forward, the moral lines appear clean. America versus the Axis. Democracy versus fascism. But inside corporate ledgers and international contracts, things were not that simple. When the U.S. entered the war, Washington immediately froze enemy assets under the Trading with the Enemy Act. American-owned property in Germany was technically seized. Communication was cut. Official business dealings were prohibited. On paper, the economic relationship ended. In practice, it became far murkier. Many American companies had already transferred operational control of their German subsidiaries to local management under Nazi supervision. The Reich had installed trustees to oversee foreign-owned businesses. Production did not stop. It simply shifted fully into Germany's wartime economy. Factories that once built consumer cars built military trucks. Chemical plants increased output for synthetic materials. Industrial systems continued running, just under different authority. From corporate headquarters in New York or Detroit, executives argued they had no power to intervene. Germany was an enemy state. The assets were effectively confiscated. They could not shut down operations even if they wanted to. And legally, that defense held weight. But here's the uncomfortable reality. The industrial infrastructure enabling wartime production had been built during years of cooperation, joint ventures, licensing agreements, and capital investment. You can't reverse years of technology transfer overnight. Once knowledge is shared, it can't be unshared. Once factories are constructed, they don't vanish because flags change. Meanwhile, American industry was mobilizing at unprecedented speed. The same corporations that had once invested in Germany were now winning massive U.S. government contracts to produce tanks, aircraft fuel, and ammunition for the Allied war effort. War production exploded, profits soared. The U.S. economy boomed. By 1943, American GDP had surged dramatically as factories ran 24 hours a day. Unemployment vanished. Industrial capacity reached historic highs. And here's the paradox. Some of the same corporate giants whose overseas subsidiaries had operated in Germany were now pillars of America's war machine. They were not on both sides in a simplistic sense. Once America entered the war, they were legally aligned with the U.S. government. But the global industrial system they had helped build did not neatly divide along moral lines. War exposed something deeper. Corporate networks are international. Capital is fluid. Technology transcends borders. Governments fight wars. Corporations follow contracts, markets, and survival. When the war finally ended in 1945, the question was no longer whether companies had been entangled. The question became, who would be held accountable? Nuremberg, justice for some, silence for others? When the war ended in 1945, the world demanded accountability. The images from Auschwitz, the mass graves, the cities reduced to rubble. The Nazi leadership would stand trial. And they did. At Nuremberg, top political and military officials faced prosecution for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggressive war. Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, the faces of the regime. But what about the industrial machine that made it all possible? That question led to a second wave of trials. The industrialist trials. Executives from IG Farben, Krupp, and other German corporations were prosecuted for using slave labor in supporting the Nazi war effort. Evidence showed that companies knowingly profited from forced labor, including prisoners from concentration camps. Executives were convicted. But here's the part history rarely emphasizes. Most sentences were light. Many executives served only a few years. By the early 1950s, most were released. Why? Because geopolitics changed, the Cold War began. Suddenly, the United States needed West Germany rebuilt as a bulwark against the Soviet Union. German industrial capacity was no longer a liability, it was strategic necessity. Reconstruction replaced punishment. Economic stability replaced moral reckoning. And here's the crucial detail. American corporations were never put on trial at Nuremberg. The jurisdiction didn't extend that far. Any entanglements between U.S. companies and German subsidiaries were largely treated as pre-war business matters, not criminal collaboration. Files were sealed. Investigations were limited. Corporate accountability faded into bureaucratic gray zones. In the 1990s and early 2000s, lawsuits from Holocaust survivors forced partial disclosures. Documents surfaced. Financial settlements were reached. But most settlements were civil, not criminal. No CEOs stood in a courtroom answering for strategic partnerships. No major American firm collapsed under the weight of wartime entanglement. By then, decades had passed. The executives were gone. The companies had merged, rebranded, expanded. History moved on. And here's the uncomfortable lesson. Political regimes fall. Generals are tried. Dictators are executed. But industrial systems endure. Corporations outlive wars. They outlive ideologies. They adapt to new governments and new markets. That's the structural difference between states and capital. States collapse, capital reorganizes. And once the Cold War redefined global priorities, moral accountability was quietly subordinated to strategic interest. Nuremberg punished the visible architects of tyranny, but the invisible architecture, finance, logistics, supply chains, largely survived intact. From war profits to post-war power. The battlefield changed when the war ended. The shooting stopped in 1945, but the economic realignment was just beginning. World War II didn't just defeat Nazi Germany. It restructured global power, and American corporations were positioned perfectly. Between 1939 and 1945, U.S. industrial output doubled. Unemployment vanished. Corporate revenues exploded. By 1945, the United States accounted for nearly half of global manufacturing output. Factories that once supplied Allied and pre-war German markets now supplied the reconstruction of Europe. Steel, machinery, vehicles, oil, chemicals, telecommunications. These industries fueled the new era. The war had wiped out competitors across Europe. American industry emerged intact, stronger than ever. But here's the deeper shift. Before the war, London had been the financial center of the world. After the war, it was New York. Before the war, the pound sterling was the global reserve currency. After the war, the dollar replaced it through the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944. Under Bretton Woods, the U.S. dollar was backed by gold and became the anchor of global trade. Countries held dollars in reserve. International transactions flowed through American banks. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was structural power. The war had drained Europe's gold reserves. The United States held two-thirds of the world's gold by 1945. Financial gravity shifted permanently, and corporations followed that gravity. Many of the same firms that had operated internationally before the war now became pillars of American global dominance. Automakers expanded into Europe and Asia. Oil companies secured Middle Eastern concessions. Technology firms integrated into emerging Cold War defense systems. The industrial networks built during the war were not dismantled. They were absorbed into the new American-led order. Military procurement contracts became Cold War defense contracts. Intelligence networks became NATO infrastructure. Financial systems became IMF and World Bank frameworks. The system matured, and here's the key point. Corporations are not ideological. They operate within whatever political system allows them to expand. In the 1930s, international firms operated inside authoritarian regimes because global business networks already existed. After 1945, they operated inside the American security umbrella because that was the dominant system. The continuity wasn't ideological loyalty, it was structural continuity. Capital seeks stability, it seeks scale, it seeks access to markets. After the war, the United States provided all three. That's why post-war reconstruction wasn't just about rebuilding cities. It was about building an American-centered global economy. Marshall Plan dollars flowed into Europe, but they flowed through American institutions. NATO bases spread across allied nations. Trade routes were secured by U.S. naval power. By 1950, the architecture of the modern global order was in place, and corporations that survived the war became embedded in that architecture, not secretly, not through shadow governments, through contracts, finance, and policy alignment. The lesson isn't that companies controlled the world. The lesson is that economic power outlasts political upheaval. Wars change flags. But industrial systems adapt, and the firms that survived World War II became foundational pillars of the post-war American century. Why this chapter fades from memory. There's a reason most people never hear this version of the story, not because it's secret or classified, but structurally inconvenient. History, especially war history, is simplified for clarity. Heroes and villains, good and evil, democracy versus dictatorship. World War II fits that framework perfectly. It was a morally unambiguous conflict. Nazi ideology was genocidal. The Allies stopped it. The narrative is clean. But economic history is never clean. It forces uncomfortable questions. How did a bankrupt Germany rebuild so quickly? Why did global corporations operate across ideological lines? Why were industrial networks allowed to resume after the war without full dismantling? The answers don't fit into a heroic narrative. They reveal something more complex. Global capitalism doesn't pause for politics. In the 1930s, multinational firms operated internationally. Global finance, investment banks, chemical conglomerates, automakers were integrated across borders. When Germany rearmed, those networks didn't suddenly disappear overnight. Business relationships are slow-moving systems. Contracts, patents, subsidiaries, supply chains don't vanish the moment a political ideology shifts. When war broke out, governments had to decide how to handle those entanglements. In some cases, subsidiaries were seized. In others, communication continued indirectly. In others still, information was simply compartmentalized. After 1945, the Cold War reshaped priorities. The Soviet Union became the primary threat. Rebuilding Western Europe quickly became more important than revisiting every corporate entanglement from the 1930s. Economic stability was prioritized over moral retribution. The United States needed industrial strength in West Germany to counter Moscow. That meant reintegrating factories, executives, and supply chains into the new Western alliance. So the narrative moved on. Textbooks focused on military strategy, concentration camps, D-Day, atomic bombs. Corporate finance, international banking agreements, patent transfers, those were considered secondary. But they weren't secondary to power. They were foundational to it. Here's the deeper truth. Political systems collapsed dramatically. Economic systems evolved quietly. When the Third Reich fell, its flags were torn down. Its leaders were prosecuted. Its ideology was condemned. But the industrial base that had powered it, the chemical plants, the automotive factories, the banking infrastructure, was absorbed into the post-war order. Because destroying industrial capacity entirely would have destabilized Europe further. So the machinery remained, not as a Nazi system, but as part of a new global system led by Washington. That's why this chapter feels incomplete in standard narratives, because it forces you to see power as structural rather than moral. It's easier to tell a story about evil leaders than about international finance and corporate continuity, but understanding power means understanding both. The modern echo. Fast forward to today. Different flags, different headlines, same structural incentives. The global economy is now more interconnected than it was in the 1930s. Supply chains stretch across continents. Capital moves in milliseconds. Multinational corporations generate revenues larger than most national GDPs. And once again, profit and geopolitics intersect in uncomfortable ways. When Western companies operate in authoritarian states today, the justification sounds familiar. We're just doing business. We can't control sovereign governments. If we don't operate there, competitors will. Those arguments are not new. In the 1930s, firms justified partnerships as standard commercial engagement. Today, companies justify supply chains in regions accused of forced labor as logistical necessity. The logic is consistent. Access to markets outweighs moral risk, unless regulation forces change. Look at modern examples. Tech firms negotiating censorship requirements in exchange for market access. Manufacturers sourcing materials from regions under human rights scrutiny. Energy companies balancing sanctions with strategic contracts. None of this is identical to the 1930s, but the pattern isn't about ideology, it's about incentives. Corporations answer to shareholders, governments answer to voters. And when the two align, expansion continues. When they conflict, moral debates begin. The difference today is transparency. In the 1930s, information traveled slowly. Documentation surfaced decades later. Today, digital records, investigative journalism, and global media expose the entanglements in real time, but exposure doesn't always equal change, because global interdependence makes disentanglement costly. And that's the key structural continuity. When economies are deeply interconnected, moral clarity becomes complicated. Sanctions ripple through markets, supply chain shifts increase prices, geopolitical fractures create instability, so governments hesitate, corporations calculate, consumers rarely see the full chain. The lesson from the 1930s isn't that history repeats identically. It's that power operates through systems, finance, trade, technology, that transcend political shifts. If you want to understand the modern world, you don't just study battles, you study contracts, you study supply chains, you study who funds whom and why. So let's close the loop. This story was never just about the 1930s. It was never just about Germany or Wall Street or World War II. It's about structure. Because when you strip away the uniforms and flags, what remains is infrastructure. banking systems, industrial supply chains, technology networks, and capital flows that operate across borders and regimes. In the 1930s, capital flowed where contracts were honored and returns were high. In the 1940s, the same industrial giants retooled and became pillars of the American war machine. After 1945, they became architects of Reconstruction. Today, in 2026, they are embedded in global supply chains, stretching from Silicon Valley to Shenzhen, from Frankfurt to Riyadh. Governments change, ideologies collapse, currencies fluctuate, but multinational corporate structures adapt. That's the real lesson. Power today doesn't look like conquest. It looks like leverage. Who controls semiconductor fabrication? Who controls rare earth mineral supply? Who controls energy infrastructure? Who controls data storage and AI training models? The battlefield has shifted from trenches to trade routes, from artillery to algorithms. And if you understand how financial and industrial systems function during crisis, you start to see how influence is exercised, quietly, contractually, and legally. That doesn't mean corporations are cartoon villains. It means incentives drive behavior. Shareholders demand returns. Executives answer to markets. Markets reward efficiency and scale. If moral costs are not priced in, they are often ignored. That was true in the 1930s. It's true in 2026. The uncomfortable reality is that economic systems outlive moral outrage. They outlive political scandals. They outlive wars. And unless structural incentives change, the system continues. That's why understanding history matters. Not the sanitized version, not the simplified version, the structural version. If this perspective challenged what you thought you knew, hit like, subscribe, because the surface narrative is rarely the full story. And in a world defined by economic leverage and global capital flows, understanding the structure is no longer optional. It's survival.